You're listening to CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, and this is The Worlds We Want, a podcast that explores the bright side of climate change, namely the change part. I'm Joel Ojic.
This is Tristan.
And this is the start of our second season, and our 10th episode.
It kind of feels like we've done more than 10 episodes at this point, because we've spoken to so many interesting people in our first year. We're really looking forward to reaching out and meeting new people in order to bring more stories to you at the intersection of research and the front line of transitions towards more livable futures for all people around the world.
Today's show actually connects us with the last episode we did in June, namely our piece on Indigenous Futures, Cultural Edition. If you didn't hear that one, it's available on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, all the places where you find your favorite podcasts. Today we continue the conversation we had with one of those guests and bring in some new voices as we discuss issues related to Indigenous self-governance in particular. As we mentioned in the last show, the reason we want to explore this topic, beyond just for interest's sake, is the clear tie that Indigenous rights has on issues related to resource extraction and preservation. And to consider issues of governance moves the conversation from the idea of empowerment towards access to actual power for these communities. These are contentious conversations between nations for sure, but it's clear that there's finally some movement in this direction, even if it's not always from governments.
On September 14th, 2018, just ahead of the Global Climate Action Summit, 29 philanthropists pledged $4 billion over the next 5 years to combat climate change, which is the largest ever philanthropic investment focused on climate change mitigation. They have committed at least $459 million through 2022 in support of land-based solutions to climate change, which includes forest conservation and restoration, as well as the recognition of Indigenous peoples and traditional communities' collective land rights and resource management. This is a long sought-after recognition that traditional communities have an important role to play in the move towards sustainable futures.
According to Victoria Tali-Corpuz, Indigenous activist of Kankanaye-Igoro descent and Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for the UN, lands belonging to Indigenous and local communities hold nearly 300 billion metric tons of carbon. That is the equivalent to over 30 times last year's global energy emissions. She says that if the rights of Indigenous people are recognized, they can have a more active role in protecting these lands for generations.
Indigenous peoples are very actively engaged in conserving the environments, their own ecosystems, because this is where they live. These are their traditional territories, and they have been the ones who have played key roles in conserving a lot of the biodiversity in those territories. In fact, many scientific reports would show that the Indigenous peoples occupy like 5% of the world's territories, but 80% of the biodiversity is found in their territory.
In this interview, courtesy of UN Human Rights, Tali-Corpuz explains how historically conservation has been used as a pretext to move people off their traditional lands.
Many of them have been evicted from their territories when these have been designated as national parks or conservation areas. There is this belief that for this area to be conserved, the people should be removed from these areas. But in reality, the better preserved areas are the areas where the Indigenous peoples are. So these kinds of displacements are violations of their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. Secondly, the livelihoods that they depend on, like they are hunters and gatherers, many of them are pastoralists, a lot of them are agricultural, they are agroforestry producers. And these kinds of livelihoods are deprived. They are deprived of this livelihood. So it leads towards even more poverty and misery, because many Indigenous people, like for instance in some parts of Africa, the pygmies are along the highways in the fringes of the national parks, and they can hardly fend for themselves. That in the name of conservation, Indigenous peoples are removed from their lands, and this is justified under the rules of protected areas set up by governments. But actually, what I'm trying to stress in my report is that these people have the inherent rights to these lands and territories, and even if these are designated as protected areas, they should be able to have a system where they co-manage the protected areas jointly with the government.
In this interview from UN University, she talks about the tensions that exist in the pursuit of co-management, but also between modern science and traditional knowledge.
We also have set up very appropriate customary governance systems that defines how we relate with nature, with the ecosystem, as well as with other people. And for me, I believe that these are the kinds of systems that ensure that some of the world's remaining ecosystems are still there, and many of these are indigenous peoples' territories. So that's where I'm really coming from when we talk about the contributions of indigenous peoples and the role, a bigger role that they should and can play in terms of addressing this environmental crisis that we say, what we call climate change. Of course, in the process of asserting this, you are faced with some challenges, no, like the standards that say maybe modern science set in terms of rigor, in terms of maybe the standards are not really appropriate for our traditional knowledge systems, and therefore the scientists who are very much the modern scientists who are held in high esteem by society in general will not accept the traditional knowledge is as scientific as their own knowledge system. And that is the other tension, the fact that modern science, whether you call it scientific forestry or agro-industrial agriculture, these are the ones that led to deforestation, and these are the ones that have destroyed the soil or the ecosystems where agriculture should be developed. So I think the fact that this is the reality now, this is what we have seen, and evidences are coming out to show that these modern systems underpinned by modern science haven't really been that sustainable after all. And the indigenous systems, which have been regarded as backward or as primitive, are now the ones that can show that they are the ones these are the systems that still are sustaining the last remaining stable ecosystems that the world has today. Our traditional knowledge systems, our worldviews, our ways of relating with nature are really very scientific and very sustainable.
You'll recall from our last show we visited Kitigan Zibi, also known as KZ, in June. This community is home to our very own co-host Joel. We are using this community as a bit of a case study for the topic of Indigenous futures. That's not to say that the experiences of this community are fully generalizable to other Indigenous communities in Canada or in other parts of the world. But talking to different people in this one community allows us to get a little bit more context than we might otherwise. Joel also knows a lot of people who are active in this community, and that's just really helpful when you want to put together a show like this one. Today we're going to return to a conversation we had with Gilbert Whiteduck, a social worker, educator, and former elected chief of Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabe First Nation. In the second half of the show, we're going to talk with Norm Ojic, the Director General of the Tribal Council for the Anishinaabe First Nation, to learn more about the Tribal Council's role in providing services to a number of Anishinaabe communities. We start with a conversation we had on a sunny Saturday afternoon in June on the ground of the KZ School, with the annual powwow in the background. Gilbert provides us with a bit of context for the complexity related to issues of self-governance within the Canadian context.
We have governance over education, we have some governance over policing, we have some governance over health and social. Again, depending on the laws of Quebec and Canada, all come into play. And of course, it comes down to some funding, being able to have the funding to hire appropriate people with background to pursue these issues.
You had mentioned our environmental sustainability and our role and how that's been kind of lost over the years. Do you find there's a connection between our ability to self-govern, how much we're able to do that, and our sustainability as a community or as a people?
Oh, definitely. Because when we look at the community here, we need to look at the history of how the community developed. Because for many decades, for example, just this community now has about 50,000 acres of land. the logging that took place in the community and how it was done was controlled by government. It's surprising. A lot of people don't know. There were 3 large logging companies logging here without the consent of the community. The community couldn't say a damn thing about it, and they were logging. And then those practices sometimes, because people had to feed their families, there were not sustainable ways of logging, so even community members continued that way. I believe, though, that with governance, now that's a broad statement. What does that look like, governance? And for me, governance means not only the reserve. The reserve is only a postage stamp of what our territory is. I'm hoping at some point with reconciliation we're going to reach that. We're going to co-manage, that's another broad statement, co-manage the sustainability of the territory by developing our own laws, developing our own sustainable laws so that even our own community members will follow it, so that there's not over-harvesting of moose or fish, and then sustainable logging that we're not seeing now, and that we're not getting any money even from the logging that's taken place. And but where are we with that governance that we talk about? We're a long way. And do we want to return back to traditional governments? And what do those look like? What are they? We've been under the Indian Act since 1876. Indian Act since 1876. And that's what we live with and we continue to live with. People have spoken, let's return back to traditional governments. And those traditional governments, certainly for Anishinaabe, as I understand it, was that we lived on the land by clans and family groupings. And we had very clear territories where families respected. One family would never go into somebody else's territory. There would be protocol. You would meet that family and saying, we're having trouble, we haven't seen any moves, our family's having difficulty, will you allow me? And the family could say, no, we're having a hard time too. Or they may say yes, and in exchange, something would be exchanged. There's always that dilemma, that thinking, that aspiration to move beyond what we have now, which I believe we have to. How would that look like? We get caught up in the day-to-day issues in the community. And those philosophical, larger discussions often, unfortunately, that don't happen. Even at the community level, people are not getting together to talk about just very broadly what these things mean and how they're going to be applied. Because families, want to feed their kids. They want jobs. They want to live well. They have a TV. They have a car. They're not just in a canoe and whatnot. It's and that's the reality. And more young people now, as you well know, because of social media. I've been exposed to the world. I've been exposed to material things that the world is offering and are wanting to get some of the same. And that's what I hope through the education process, though, that young people, yes, we want the material thing, but more importantly, is looking internally, that internal inspiration that goes beyond the material world.
We asked him to give us his thoughts on the process called reconciliation in Canada, a word that is born from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or the TRC. A process meant to document what happened to Indigenous peoples in the process of creating Canada, including the residential school system and the traumatic impacts that system has had on many people of many nations. Turns out the truth, according to the TRC, was a cultural genocide. The reconciliation part is a call to action to try to address this truth and the systemic issues that now accompany it.
In June 2015, the TRC released an executive summary of its finding, along with 94 calls to action regarding reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. These calls to action are mostly directed at various levels of government and address issues of child welfare, education, language, culture, and justice, among other important areas.
For many Canadians, this document forces them to reconsider their historical mythologies around the founding of this country and implementation of ideals around peace, order, and good government.
We link to this document in the show notes.
Well, my position, I've been asked that before, and and that's a government word, reconciliation. Yeah. And for me anyway, in my family, I say I have nothing to reconciliate about. It's not about me. Yeah. It's about others who have come to our land. I'm willing to sit down with anyone, and we're going to work it out. But never I don't want it to do. I do not want to do it at any cost. I refuse to be in a way bought out with money. I know money's needed, but so reconciliation, it's other people that have to learn about Indigenous people, have to be open, because we've always been open. The fact that the territory is populated by non-Indigenous people, they must have been very welcoming since the beginning of time, right?
White Duck shares with us the way that bureaucracy can get in the way of the practical interactions between communities.
Quebec has an idea, and it's their idea of where our traditional territory is extended to, and we've had community members charged with things like fishing and being told it is outside our traditional territory. And when they were asked, show us on the map where our territory is, we've never seen it. So that's interesting.
That's an excellent point, because you're exact there. I made those requests, and they said, we know where the boundaries are. So I said, give me the map. We're allowed to see the map, and they wouldn't give it. So I pursued it to try to access to information and whatnot, and I went before a tribunal. And the tribunal was made up of one judge, and I had never been to tribunal. I didn't bring no lawyer, and they had two lawyers, and who had prepared like a briefing document, who then told the judge, I guess we can call the person, you can't allow that. You can't allow them to get the information and whatnot, and here's why. Well, I was blown out of the water, because they were using legal precedents to do it, And you're right, people were charged because they were saying you're now on another nation's territory. As you know, there are many nations in Quebec, and in central Quebec in particular, we've always had good relationship with the Atikameks. And some people have gone to the Gouin, which is a part of
Where would the Atikameks be located?
In central Quebec.
Okay.
There are 3 large communities are located there. And so when they told me, we're going to arrest you if you go and all that, I said, you know what, I've met with the chiefs, and I did, and with the Grand Chief, and say, is it okay, that we go there? Yeah, sure, we share the territory. They still told us that they would arrest us, and they would charge us. And I mean, the story goes even further, because when I got on band council, there were 13 cases before the courts related to hunting and fishing. And the community had been working it through slowly. It hadn't reached the court yet, but there's costs for lawyers and research and whatnot. And the community had expended about $750,000 of money the community didn't have. And at one point I asked the minister who comes, well, why are you doing that? And he never answered me. He never gave me anything. Then at one point I get a call to say, oh, by the way, all of those cases have been removed. Nothing's resolved. We spent all of this money that we could have spent on language and housing and all of that, all to start all over again, which is occurring now. There are cases in court spending money we don't got.
And so if I understand this correctly, you're looking for ways to negotiate with the other people who this is their territory, and you should be able to have these direct conversations with leadership,
Exactly.
but you're not allowed to do that.
No, because traditionally that's what the way it was done. It was between nations, sitting down, compromising, understanding each other, sharing of the land and all of that. But the government is determining, And once they give you a ticket, whatever they're going to give you, I mean, you can't run away from it. You got to defend it. You got to defend the territory.
He shares with us how flaws in the system force the hand of many communities, who turn to direct action in the quest of change.
And I could go on and on about the logging, the mining, the kind of mining they're looking at constantly. And that's why on and on, Indigenous people have to do roadblocks and, do confrontational things. And I've told government people, do you think I wake up in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to go block the highway because, I feel like doing it? It's because we have no other alternative. You're not listening. You don't give a damn about what we're asking, and we're willing to sit down with you, and that's the only thing we've got left, And I've always worried, though, and Oka was a good example.
Good evening. At one point, there were as many as 12 native barricades in Quebec, but tonight only one is still standing. It's the one that triggered the whole dispute, the one that Quebec police tried to storm 53 days ago, the one in Oka. Mohawks erected that barricade last March. They were trying to prevent the town from expanding a 9-hole golf course on what they claim is ancestral land.
The Oka crisis is an important moment in Canadian history. It was a 78-day standoff that took place in the summer of 1990 between Mohawk or Kanien'kehá:ka protesters, police, and the army. The emergence of the crisis was a straw that broke the camel's back sort of situation, in that there was a proposed expansion of a golf course and development of condos on disputed land held in commons by the Mohawk community at Oka, called the Pines, which included a burial ground. Expansion being the key word, as this wasn't the first incursion on these lands. The issue started in the 1960s and accompanied a history of bad relations between the communities.
Tonight, the barricade is completely surrounded by the Canadian Army. The soldiers have dug themselves in after a day of high tension and drama. It all began at about 1 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon. Army units moved in here at a location the Mohawks refer to as the North Pole. Soldiers also took this barricade on the western edge of the community. Then they pressed on toward the final blockade. It all seemed pretty easy, that is, until they reached the center of the Indian land and things came to a dramatic climax. The CBC's Neil MacDonald was there.
This violent flare-up in the summer of 1990, which ended a week after 2,500 soldiers descended on the site of a barricade, resulted in the death of one Sûreté du Québec officer and a lot of violence, including the stabbing by bayonet of future Olympian Wanique Horn-Miller, who was a 14-year-old girl at the time. The golf course was never built. This moment brought much attention to the situation being faced by First Nations peoples in Canada, along with protests such as the disputes of southern Moresby Island and the war in the woods in Clayoquot Sound. These actions fueled movements that continue to this day, such as Isle No More.
Even before the Oka crisis, there had been a major confrontation in Restigouche, in the Restigouche Mi'kmaq community years ago, and where there was a clear demonstration of the paramilitary called the SQ, I call them the SQ, paramilitary, who moved into the community. The community had been exercising their rights to fish salmon. And one morning out of the blue, like at 5 in the morning, like helicopters and riot squad people appeared in the community. They got arrested, the big confrontation, and then people from across Canada, leadership came to support and all of that. Eventually a deal was worked out. But it showed me that any community who will try to resist like that, just expect that they're going to move in, and they're going to move in big. All of the ministers, or whether it be the premier that you meet, they don't get it. They don't get it. Do we give up? Of course not. We never give up. There's always hope. We got to find, little nuggets. But as I've told people, because I'm often told by ministers or bureaucracy, well, we're making baby steps. I'm sorry. No more baby steps. I call them, we need leaps and bounds now. It's got to move, but it's not. Is it doable? It'll take young people like you, Joel, maybe, or, I've been angry often in my life. I'm still angry when I see things. I'm still angry when I see people being arrested for exercising their right to take care of their family, or trying to get something from the land to help. I get angry when I hear of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I get angry when I know in homes, they're full of mold and nobody really, or water that can be drank. But I was told by elders a long time ago, anger will not fuel the movement towards something sustainable. So kind of push down your anger. But I have real difficulty with that. And I share also with people is that often when I've spoken publicly, I always try to think about a 5-year-old that's standing right there. And what in my message and my movement am I doing to make a difference for that child when they become a young man or a young woman? What am I doing? And I remember driving home from many meetings from the city. I'd be driving home and I say, you know what, Gilbert? And I presented to the stand committee, you've done damn nothing today. Nothing has changed. Your message is going nowhere. Yet you're going back. And I used to always have to try to question myself and thinking about the land, because ultimately it is about the land. It is about that sustainability, and what are we going to do collectively, individually, and how does that look like, and how will that change come? Governments who are often, I guess, inspired by corporations and whatnot, and with the idea of creating employment for people, and people are hard up the local area here, where the lumbering industry was very strong in the past, which are really diminished now. The town has shrunk to being very small, and there's more talk now about mining in some key areas of the territory, and then say, oh, what kind of mining are you going to do? How are you going to impact the water that you're going to have to use, and whatnot. So, and we're not experts. At the end of the day, we need experts. We need people, again, to be advising the community to say, we need to consider, and that's the expertise. And I always believe it's got to be our expertise. You, Joel, as an Anishinaabe, another Anishinaabe. Yeah, it's good to get other people. Yeah, I agree. But when it comes from a community member or from someone from the nation, for me, it's something much stronger. And that's why education becomes important. And that's why also learning about the traditions, the values that we've carried since time immemorial, since we've been here, how important those are to pursue those very important issues.
The process of working out these issues takes time, effort, and money. And, well, it's helpful to also have a sense of humor.
In order to get government attention, they put a case forward demonstrating that we had title to Parliament Hill, to the Supreme Court territory, and to the Chaudière Falls. So the government reviewed all of that, and that's going to be negotiated now in LeBreton Flats, where they're planning to build a new arena and all that, for the senators and whatnot. So that's all under negotiation.
Didn't you send a bill for $212 million once?
Is there send an invoice?
Well, what happened is that some of our people had gone to camp in the park,
Okay.
young people and whatnot. And so the game wardens, their system sent a bill of about, I don't know what it was, $1,000. So the first time around, I don't know what I made it, $1 million. I said, it's $1,000. You owe us at least $1 million. And then they sent me another bill, and then it kept going up. And I kept sending them a bill, a very legal bill and all that you owe for the usage of our territory all of these years. It eventually stopped. If that's what you want to play, well, let's play it. You know?
Yeah, that's one strategy.
But they really tried. It was crazy.
That was Gilbert Whiteduck.
One of the key tenets of a movement is pre-existing organizational strength. So we wanted to learn about how some of the Anishinaabe nations work together to serve their communities, today and into the future.
Cheryl and I first had to learn a little bit about the ties that connect Anishinaabe communities, and we did that while getting our tour of Casey and Joel's truck.
Algonquin communities, so they're in Quebec, but they're also some in Ontario?
Yeah.
And these are First Nations communities, like you would call them kind of communities, tribes, bands?
I would say community, although we're all Algonquin, we're all
Yeah.
part of the Algonquin Nation, but each community definitely has its own unique characters and its own unique dialect of the language. To a degree, it's its own unique tradition. So even though we're all Algonquins, it's kind of like saying, I guess if you treat it as a nation, Manitoba is different from Quebec,
Yeah.
Ontario is different from Alberta,
Yeah.
even though everybody's Canadian. Same language,
Is it a
but
language
very
that
different.
is it like Anishinaabe?
Not exactly, because it's so similar to Ojibwe
That's what I was
that you
wondering.
could understand people from out west.
Yeah.
Like if you go to Alberta, you can actually understand Ojibwe people very easily. Whereas if you go down south, like let's say to Massachusetts, even though they're technically Algonquins,
Yeah.
it's more different.
Okay, so it's like how English is a Germanic language, and there's some, like, for example, I could understand Scots,
Yeah.
but I might not be able to understand Frisian.
Yeah,
But they're all the same
exactly.
root. It's
Yeah,
old,
they come from the same thing, but
Okay.
yeah, you definitely have an easier time out west
Right.
than you do.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and I mean, there's Cree also that sort of connects a lot. Like, a lot of people have shared. Like, there's.
Kinda.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know where. Who
No,
told me that.
they're our homies to the north,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, yeah.
For lack of a better way to say it, they're our cousins up north. You know, we're not the same, but we're
Yeah.
similar enough.
Yeah.
I took a semester of Cree, introductory Cree at
Yeah.
Concordia, so
Yeah.
it's some of it is very different because I don't want to say who influenced who,
Yeah, right.
but a lot of it has a lot in common with Inuit, as
Oh.
well as a lot of it having a lot in common with us. So you can tell,
Yeah.
you know, they have a lot more words for snow than we do,
Right.
or whales, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
And you can tell there's kind of a very northern influence there.
Right.
Could be I'm talking nonsense, but that's what it seemed like to me.
Yeah.
I had a really hard time not speaking Cree with an Algonquin accent.
Yeah.
Because the words are so similar.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Teacher would shake her head at me, or sometimes I'd laugh and be like, "Your word for pencil means book stick, really?" And she'd be like, "You shut up."
Book stick?
Book stick. That's in Algonquin. That's how they say pencil.
Okay.
Book stick.
Yeah.
So I mean, I could see why.
Yeah.
It makes sense. It's made out of wood, and you write with it
In books?
in books. So it probably means something else for them. But for us, the literal translation was book stick. So I was like, that means book stick.
Well, language is really funny when you think about it, hey? Like Barba Papa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whose papa has a barb like that?
Yeah.
No kidding. That's kind of strange.
Algonquin Nation, good afternoon.
For details on how some of these communities are organized to serve their members, we called this guy.
Hello.
Hey, Norm.
Oh, hey, good afternoon. My name is Norm Odrick. I'm Director General of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council, which is located in Kitigan-Zibi. I'm from Kitigan-Zibi myself. I'm a member of the Kitigan-Zibi community.
We asked him to explain to us how this particular tribal council works and what its role is in this community.
When you think tribal council, the first thing that comes to mind is political, but from what used to be Indian Affairs, now is Indigenous Services Canada, what we deliver is services that they used to deliver. They used to have engineers, they used to have people who can help you with construction and with your management and things like that. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, they decided to delegate those services to entities that they called tribal councils. So really, we don't receive any political funding whatsoever. We receive funding to deliver those services. So in 1992, when the tribal council was made, it was to deliver the services that we're funded for, but there was also the political component with it as well. I was hired in 2004, and the chiefs and the elected reps were looking at splitting the administration and politics because there were so many big political files that they had on their laps. They didn't have time to deal with the administrative issues for the office and the budgets, the hiring, and things like that. So what we did was, in 2005, we had it passed where they adopted the administrative bylaws, in which they each named a member to the board of directors. So it's not a political person on the board of directors for the services side. Usually it's the director general from each community. And then in 2007, they had the political bylaws, the interim political bylaws adopted, which have been enforced until now, which is something that we're trying to work on at the moment.
Man, I know sometimes back home it was pretty hard to keep the administrative and the political side from blending into each other and bleeding.
Yeah, well, what would happen is we'd end up making it, like a multi-day meeting, but the chiefs, they've got so much on their plate. Because don't forget, in the communities, the way it works, it's not like a municipality. Joel, you know this well, being on council. The band council is responsible for everything, including welfare, including health, including education, policing. The scope of what they have under their authority is much, much larger than a municipality government. It's more along the lines of, say, a provincial government.
How does the tribal council compare to what we might see in other First Nations communities in Canada?
It all depends. Quebec is a bit unique. The reason why we don't have the communities from Ontario being members with us is that Ontario is structured differently from Quebec. In Quebec, we've got different commissions that assist the communities. We've got the First Nations Education Council. We've got the Economic Development Council. And as well, there's one on human resources. So they're able to help, most of the communities across Quebec dealing with those big files. Well, in Ontario, a lot of it is handled at the tribal council level, and they receive additional funding to deliver those services. As well, for us, the reason why we don't receive any political funding either is that we don't currently have a comprehensive land claim in place. A lot of the other tribal councils where they receive money, it's in the form of a loan through, I guess now it's Crown and Indigenous Services Canada, whereas they're looking at putting in place a comprehensive claim. So that's how they're able to pay for their political things. But we don't have a comprehensive claim in the system. Our land is still unceded. We're not under treaty, and it's not something that's really that all of our communities agree with. They don't agree with the land claim policy as it currently stands.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the bigger service projects that you've delivered.
Well, especially with the engineering and the construction, it happens often where we're called upon to help them with different projects. But 2 years ago, the community of Long Point was awarded a new school. However, they were at that time they were going through remedial financial planning. So this was a big project. It was a project with including the road that needed to be built to bring in the services, etc. It was a project of about $10 million. And what we ended up doing was we were asked to manage both the construction of that school and we were asked to manage the finances of it. So we did that over a period of about 2 years, and we made sure that everything came in on time and on budget.
I was wondering, you were talking a lot about the projects that you work on, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of helping
communities manage particular public services and so on. But has it ever happened that you kind of you work on a project or on an issue that kind of involves both communities that are part of the tribal council, but also, for instance, the Quebec or the federal government?
Oh, that happens all the time, especially where I'll give you an example where in one community where everything is on rock and they needed new lagoons. Well, they had to more or less install it on land that was included in a municipality. Or, for example, the community where we built the school, they don't actually have reserve status. They've got what's called their status is as a settlement, so they're actually part of their territory. Again, it's unceded; it's Algonquin territory as far as we're concerned, but it falls within the boundaries of what they say is the municipality of La Force. So oftentimes there has to be collaboration between the municipality and the community. In a lot of our communities, they don't have enough population to justify, say, a full fire department. So we'll have an agreement with a municipality. The same thing usually for waste, like for dumps and for recycling. We have to help them negotiate deals with the neighboring municipalities so that, for the economy of scale, to make it affordable.
What's it like to work with Canada in that capacity? Like you mentioned the Minister's Office, what's it like to work with them?
To be honest, with the regional office, we've always had a very good relationship with them. A lot of the people they've got who look after infrastructure have been there for a long time, and they do give us a lot of leeway, and they give us a lot of credit and a lot of trust. But, we've been in operation for a long time, our organization. We've got a proven track record. So that relationship is good. The problem is more on the political side where programs don't exist to assist us to develop our political sector.
And what kind of stuff would that look like?
Well, really, say you were comparing it to any other kind of regrouping of different communities, they have money at least to be able to get together and meet, to work on different files together. Well, politically, we don't receive a dollar. We don't receive any money for our chiefs and elected reps to get together to discuss political issues. Even though we're bombarded with changes to legislation and to policy, we don't have anyone even who can analyze those things for them. So myself and my communications agent work closely with the Grand Chief and the elected reps and the chiefs to try to collaborate and piece things up and deal with different files. But it's hard because we've already got full-time jobs, so... It makes it a challenge, and we don't always manage to get everything done that we'd like to.
We asked him to give us an example of how they have been able to leverage what little they have to deal with important issues that have social and environmental impacts.
Last year, we were working on a file. It's the near-surface disposal for in Chalk River, where they want to make a big dump for all of the nuclear materials that they've been amassing over the years. And so we did receive some funding for that to analyze it, but the amount that we got was very, very minimal. And we don't have an expert on hand who can deal with nuclear issues and all the rest of that. So what we had to do was partner up with another organization to hire experts to look at it. But politically, we don't have anyone doing that research to explain it to them or to allow them to lobby to make sure that it's done as safely as possible. And it's not an issue that only affects our nation. It affects everyone along who's downriver from the downriver on the Ottawa River from the site.
Norm, what do you think are going to be, as we move forward, the biggest issues that you're facing or that the Tribal Council is facing?
Well, there is a policy that's in place right now that's called the Recognition of Indigenous Rights. It's that recognition and reconciliation framework that they're working on. We haven't seen any drafts of that yet, but we hear it's coming, and they want to change things. They want to make things a lot more along the lines of a self-government type agreement. But until we see what it actually looks like, it's hard for us to know what's coming. I know that's going to be a big one. They're making changes to our funding as well for all of the communities, where they're talking about a new fiscal relationship. But a lot of it is they want the communities to be certified, and they're imposing who's going to do the training for it. And it ends up being we've asked for more leeway and more flexibility with our funding, and instead it's going to be really, really cumbersome to try to fit into the way that they've designed it.
What kind of things would you want to see in, let's say, the next 10, 20 years happening for the Anishinaabe nations?
I would like to see us take on more services. What we're trying to do now, we put in a proposal to try to make a nationwide police force. We're hoping that we'll receive funding for a feasibility study and to help make a structure for that. Some of our communities are working towards taking over youth protection and different social services like that. If we could take over the youth protection, that would be great. I want to see us become more self-sufficient where we're not relying on government funding. I want to see more ECDEV. I want to see more development where there's revenue streams coming into the communities that they can count on, that are stable and that are predictable.
Many people don't have a clear sense as to how money is used in First Nations communities, and there are a lot of myths in terms of where the money comes from and how it is spent. Norm clarifies this for us.
One thing that people aren't aware of is they think that there's a whole bunch of money that comes to the communities that are taxpayer funds, but in actuality, First Nations across Canada have a lot of money in trust, and the way that the government actually funds us is through the interest on those trusts. It's not from taxpayer dollars. That's a common misconception that stays out there, but there's trillions of dollars in those trusts that generate revenue. That there's such a bureaucracy within government too. It's such a big machine that only pennies on the dollar end up coming to us in the end. A lot of it gets eaten up by government, by the people in the offices looking after Indigenous services and health and all the rest of that. Like you said, you end up having to make everything stretch as far as possible. In 2015, they had redid the guidelines for the Tribal Council program, and we ended up getting cut by 15% in 2015. But the funding for the program's been been frozen since 1996, so we don't receive any kind of annual indexation. They talk about lifting the 2% cap on funding for different things for the communities, but I don't even receive a 2% increase every year. I have the same budget year after year after year, meaning my funding's actually being cut as the cost of living increases, but they also cut 15% in 2015. So for infrastructure, we were told that for the maintenance, of roads and bridges and all the rest of that we're funded at 80% of the cost to maintain it. But when we looked at the actual cost of it, we were only funded at 50%. So what happens? The road ends up falling apart quickly. You can't maintain it properly. It ends up washing out, or it falls apart. And the same with other infrastructure. If you don't properly maintain something, it doesn't last. And it's not because they don't want to. It's because you're receiving 50 cents on the dollar for what it would actually cost to take care of it.
And I should say that for me, so part of my studies involves studying public policy and public administration. And so maybe this is kind of like, I definitely have a bias here, but I find this very interesting to learn about this, because we don't, in our basic public admin classes, we don't learn about it.
No.
And I even just, when I was visiting Joel towards the end of the summer, and he was telling me about his work and how, Kirigan-Zibi was, developing its own climate policy and its own kind of environmental policy. And it's not something that we learn about in our classrooms, so it's really interesting to hear about how it works and what kind of unique challenges you face and so on.
I think just the scope of everything that a chief and council is responsible for would surprise a lot of ordinary Canadians.
All right, Joel. So this summer you had a pretty cool project to work on. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I lucked out on that one. Actually, I was back home with our Department of Natural Resources and Wildlife. I know almost everybody there really well, so it felt good to go home and get to work. And what we were working on mostly is, if anybody's familiar with the SARA Act, which is the Species at Risk Protection here in Canada. We receive money through a fund called AFSAR, which is for Aboriginal communities to take care of our species at risk. And one particular part of the SARA Act is Section 11, which says an entity, a city, a province, or say a First Nation could actually take jurisdiction of its wildlife from Canada and enforce the SARA Act. So we're kicking that around.
Nice. And then I guess what were you doing specifically? I mean, you're a biology student full time.
Yeah.
So
I was split between half the time in the office doing research and half being out in the field helping our technicians. We're starting some programs right now from scratch, actually. Our biologist, Matthew Ford, is kicking ass and taking names in some fields where we've never done any work before, like monarch butterfly research, for example. They're an endangered species that resides in the community, and we're starting a new program from the ground up, looking at how we can enhance our protection for them. So I was doing research for our director, Linda Dwyer, for Matthew, and spending some time in the field as well, actually getting hands-on time with the animals, seeing how our technicians do things.
any interesting animals that you ran into that did?
You would be surprised. We have over 400 wood turtles that pass through the territory. 5 of them right now are wearing little miniature backpacks that act as radio transmitters. So we go see them, go check them out a couple times a week, and they're doing pretty well. But you'll see a few of them. We actually have some pictures of a few of them that are missing limbs and still going. They're pretty tough. We've seen all kinds of stuff. We had an owl, an injured owl. A lot of things pass through on a daily basis. Right now, the community is actually overrun with bears. I wish I was at home for that, but I'm not. So you never know. You never know what you're going to find every day.
And I guess in your work at the Natural Resources Department, what would you say are the kind of principal threats to conservation in the community?
Wow, there's actually a few right now. We're still getting a good look at what climate change is predicted to do. That's going to wreak a lot of havoc. We have invasive species like the beech, what do they call that thing? There's a bug that's hammering the beech trees right now, and I can't think of it because I'm live on the air. Beech scale. We're actually cutting a lot of our beech trees right now because they're going to be dead in 5 to 10 years anyway, if not quicker, because of beech scale, which came into Canada through Halifax Harbor, and it's just been bulldozing its way through our country. So that changing climates, resource issues that we talked about in the show, like logging, we don't always have a lot of say in what's going to happen on the territory. Those are some big ones right there.
And you've been talking to me a little bit about some of the public engagement that will be required on some of these issues. What kind of stuff are you looking towards? Now, you've done part of the research part, but you're looking towards engaging the community of KZ. What's that going to look like?
Well, what we need to do, especially as we explore these avenues to take more power and more responsibility for our wildlife, is gauge community interest in what people want. How do they want that to look? How do they want us to best protect these animals or flora or whatever? So a lot of it is going to be giving presentations on what we have, on presentations of what's affecting them right now, on the SARA Act and what it says in terms of regulations, and on climate change, so that people can come away with this, I don't want to say knowledgeable enough, but yeah, knowledgeable enough to make decisions governing our future. Like before I came to school here, I couldn't have explained climate change to you. I didn't know particularly what it meant other than the world is getting warmer. I didn't know much about our species, and I wouldn't be very, very well equipped to make decisions on how we proceed in the future. So it's important to be able to serve our community and giving them that knowledge. Then we can actually start engaging them on a more democratic process on where to go from here.
Right. And one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking about this off air was that something that's relatively new is that you're actually developing your own policies in a number of different environmental areas, right? Like your own climate change policy.
Yeah.
And how do you see that, I guess, moving forward in the future, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? How is that an important thing?
Well, what I would like to see, part of our situation on the reserve and off of it as well, is we're not always subject to Quebec or Canada's legislative guidelines as far as natural resources go, because being so would subject us to not being able to be on our traditional territory, not carrying out traditional activities like hunting, fishing, trapping, etc. But we do still need something in the way of a framework of legislations to take care of that kind of stuff. So what I would like to see moving forward is having our own robust system of checks and balances on what can and cannot be done in the territory by First Nations and mainstream Canadians alike. I'd like to see more interaction with other communities in terms of our shared responsibility in taking care of the territory, in terms of gathering data, in terms of mixing science with traditional knowledge to keep track of this kind of stuff. Like what situations do we all face in terms of climate change? What can we all be doing to monitor that situation? And one of the things that Linda had shown me that she's working on right now is a program called the Guardians program, where Canada actually makes money available to First Nations to be doing things on the land, such as cultural activities, language protection, environmental protection, research, collecting data and things like that, that some communities have already implemented. Like I know out west, some of the communities in BC are actually monitoring what's going on in their waters fishing-wise, for example.
And you see, I think you kind of picked up on something which is kind of at the core of this particular show, which is, you know, how reconciliation or Indigenous self-governance overlaps with issues of sustainability and working towards livable futures. And that's the idea that, you know, environmental issues typically don't kind of respect community boundaries, right?
Right.
And I think an interesting question, I'm wondering what you think about this, is what do you think the future of collaboration between Indigenous communities and, you know, the Canadian government, Quebec government, and municipalities, what that collaboration will look like in the future on these kinds of issues?
Well, again, if we go on what I would like to see, pie in the sky, if it could be anything.
Hey, that's what this show's about.
We dream big here. We dream big on the worlds we want. What I would like to see is an organization, something like Norm's Tribal Council, but in terms of the environment, like a First Nations Ministry of Natural Resources, or maybe an Anishinaabe Ministry of Natural Resources, which actually worked hand in hand with Quebec as partners instead of a more paternalistic approach that they have towards us right now, because it really does feel that way. I can tell you some of the organizations in Quebec right now have a fairly dim view of us, like some comments made by CPAC, for example, which takes care of parkland and recreation land. They aren't really interested in a partnership so much as they're the authority. What I would like to see is an equal footing, many community approach towards these kind of issues, where we work with Quebec as partners.
Great.
Equals.
So let us know what you think. You can reach out to us on various social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and Medium. Please share your thoughts with us. We are looking for some projects and topics to cover this season, so please share your ideas and connections with us. Part of our goal this season is to include more international voices, and that could be you. Get in touch with us.
You can subscribe to The Worlds We Want and never miss an episode. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, and all the other platforms where you can find your free podcasts. Tell your friends. Also, please leave us a review if you like the show so that other people like you can find us. Thank you for all the support we've received so far. We really appreciate it.
Writing by Cheryl Gladu. Thanks to Allison O'Reilly for recording help. Editing by Cheryl Gladu. Music featured in this episode is Are You Well and Lay It On Me by Best Friend, and Plans Fall Through by Alexia Avina. And of course, the whole thing is powered by
Bicycle.
All right.
You didn't tell me that at the start. What are you talking about?
All right.
Amazing. So now we can press stop.
All right.